What happens when a group of reckless bikers pushes their luck too far, teasing a seemingly ordinary black lab? They have no idea this dog isn't just any pet. It's a highly trained star in the making, working alongside Keanu Reeves for an intense movie role. The bikers thought it was all fun and games, until their antics set off a chain of events they never saw coming. Stick around to uncover the jaw-dropping story of loyalty, danger, and a Hollywood twist you won't believe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories that will leave you inspired. The morning sun cast a soft golden glow over the countryside estate, its rays filtering through the leaves of towering oak trees. A thin veil of mist hugged the earth, lending the air an ethereal stillness. The gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird were the only sounds breaking the silence. In the open field behind the house, Keanu stood with Shadow, his loyal black Labrador. The two moved in quiet synchrony, a seamless exchange of signals and responses. Keanu raised his hand, and Shadow darted forward, retrieving a small leather pouch from a wooden post, before returning to sit obediently at his feet. "Perfect as always," Keanu said, his voice warm and calm. He crouched down to ruffle Shadow's ears, earning a happy wag of the dog's tail. "You're going to steal the show, buddy," Shadow responded with a soft bark, his dark eyes gleaming with intelligence and affection. The tranquility of the moment was interrupted by the distant roar of engines. Keanu straightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the winding road that bordered his property. The sound grew louder, and soon a gang of bikers came into view, their motorcycles kicking up dust as they sped past. One of them, a wiry figure with a scar cutting across his cheek, flung an empty beer can toward the edge of the field. The can landed with a clatter, startling a bird into flight. Shadow's ears perked up, but he stayed by Keanu's side, unflinching. Keanu's gaze followed the bikers until they disappeared down the road, their laughter echoing faintly behind them. He let out a slow breath, his hand absently resting on Shadow's head. "Don't let them get to you," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "They're just noise." Shadow tilted his head as if understanding, his tail wagging lightly. Keanu smiled faintly, but his jaw tightened. He didn't like the feeling those bikers left behind, a faint sense of unease that lingered like smoke in the air. The day carried on peacefully. Keanu and Shadow continued their training, practicing more intricate maneuvers that would be used in an upcoming movie scene. The black lab moved with precision and agility, leaping through hoops, retrieving objects from heights, and responding flawlessly to Keanu's subtle cues. Despite the earlier disruption, the bond between the two shone brighter with each task, a testament to the trust and love they shared. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of amber and pink, a boy appeared near the edge of the property. Keanu noticed him immediately, a skinny kid with tousled hair and a nervous energy that betrayed his attempt at stealth. He couldn't have been older than 12, and his wide eyes were glued to Shadow, who was now trotting back with a small pouch in his mouth. "Hey," Keanu called out, his voice gentle but firm. The boy froze, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "It's okay. You're not in trouble. Come here." The boy hesitated but eventually stepped forward, his sneakers crunching against the gravel. "I didn't mean to bother you," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. I saw your dog, and he's amazing." Keanu smiled, crouching to meet the boy's eye level. "His name's Shadow. And yeah, he's pretty amazing. What's your name?" "Jamie," the boy replied, glancing at Shadow, who was now sniffing his hand. "Does he really do stunts? Like in movies?" Keanu chuckled softly. "That's the idea, but it takes a lot of work. Shadow wasn't always this good, you know. We've been training for years." Jamie's eyes lit up. "Can I watch? I mean, just for a little bit? I won't get in the way, I promise." Keanu considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but only if you stay back and follow the rules. Shadow's a pro, but he's still a dog. He needs focus." The boy nodded eagerly, and Keanu couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field. Jamie sat cross-legged near the edge, watching in awe as Shadow executed each task with flawless precision. For a while, the world seemed simple and safe, a bubble of shared wonder and camaraderie. But the faint growl of engines in the distance reminded Keanu that peace, no matter how perfect, was never guaranteed to last. The next morning arrived with the same quiet charm, but Keanu's unease from the previous day lingered. He stood on the front porch, sipping a cup of coffee as Shadow rested at his feet. The black lab's ears twitched at every sound, ever vigilant. Keanu gazed at the winding road in the distance, half expecting the roar of engines to break the calm again. Sure enough, just as the sun climbed higher, the faint, unmistakable growl of motorcycles reached his ears. Keanu's grip on his mug tightened as the gang came into view, roaring past the property with the same reckless energy. This time, they slowed down near his fence. The leader, the wiry man with the scar, glanced over at Keanu, locking eyes with him for a long moment. His smirk was cold, taunting. Keanu didn't flinch, but Shadow rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Easy," Keanu murmured, placing a hand on the dog's head. Shadow quieted, but his posture remained alert. The bikers sped off, their laughter fading into the distance. Keanu exhaled slowly, his mind already weighing options. He didn't want trouble, but he also wouldn't let anyone endanger Shadow or the work they had put into his training. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a lifeline, and Keanu wasn't about to let that bond be disrupted. Later that day, Keanu met with his stunt coordinator, a grizzled man named Joe, with decades of experience in the industry. They were rehearsing a key sequence for the movie, one where Shadow would have to leap onto a moving platform, retrieve a vital prop, and escape before simulated flames closed in. It was a complex, high-pressure stunt, but Keanu had faith in Shadow's abilities. "Shadow's got this," Joe said, watching as the dog practiced the sequence flawlessly. "You've trained him well, honestly better than some of the human actors I've worked with." Keanu chuckled but remained focused. "He's the best partner I've ever had. I just want to make sure he's ready. There's no room for error in a scene like this." As they continued rehearsing, Jamie appeared again, lingering near the edge of the field. Keanu caught sight of him and waved him over. "Back for more?" he asked with a grin. Jamie nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with excitement. "I've been thinking about yesterday. Does Shadow ever mess up?" Keanu knelt beside the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Of course he does. Nobody's perfect, Jamie. Not me, not you, and not Shadow. What matters is that he keeps trying, and we trust each other. That's the key." Jamie nodded solemnly, his admiration for both Keanu and Shadow growing with every word. Before he could say more, a loud bang shattered the calm. It came from the direction of the road, a sharp, jarring sound that sent a flock of birds into the air. Keanu and Shadow both turned toward the noise, their instincts kicking in. From the tree line near the road, the gang of bikers emerged, this time cutting across the edge of the property. One of them held a spray can, shaking it noisily before tagging the wooden fence with a crude symbol. Another revved his engine, his laughter carrying over the distance like nails on a chalkboard. Keanu's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He motioned for Shadow to stay by his side. Jamie, however, looked terrified. "Are they going to hurt us?" the boy whispered. Keanu glanced at him, his voice calm but firm. "No one's hurting anyone. Stay here." He approached the fence, his steady stride and unshaken demeanor making the bikers pause for a moment. "You've had your fun," he called out, his voice level but commanding. "Now move along." The leader dismounted his bike, swaggering toward Keanu with an air of defiance. He was younger than Keanu had expected, maybe in his mid-20s, but his scarred face and hardened eyes hinted at a life that had taken too many wrong turns. "And what if we don't?" the leader taunted, tilting his head. "What are you going to do about it, Hollywood?" Keanu didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he held his ground, his gaze steady. "I'm not here to fight you. I just want you to leave." The leader chuckled, looking back at his crew. Hear that, boys? He's not here to fight. He turned back to Keanu, his smirk fading slightly. You think you're better than us, don't you? I don't think about you at all, Keanu replied evenly. The leader's jaw clenched, but before he could say more, Shadow barked sharply, stepping forward. The gang members flinched, their bravado slipping for a split second. Keanu placed a calming hand on Shadow's head, signaling him to stay. Last warning, Keanu said, his voice low but resolute. Leave. The leader hesitated, clearly torn between escalating the situation and backing down. After a tense moment, he raised his hands mockingly and signaled to his crew, Fine, we're leaving, for now. They roared off, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Keanu watched them disappear, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. Jamie approached hesitantly, his small frame trembling slightly. They're going to come back, aren't they? Jamie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu looked down at him, his expression softening. Maybe, but if they do, we'll be ready. Shadow wagged his tail faintly, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon, ever watchful. The tension from the confrontation lingered in the air as Keanu spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the property's boundaries. He repaired the damaged fence, his movements deliberate and calm, while Shadow stayed close, pacing the perimeter like a silent sentinel. Jamie sat nearby, watching Keanu work with an intensity far beyond his years. Do you deal with this kind of stuff all the time? Jamie asked, his voice tentative. Keanu paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He turned to the boy with a small, reassuring smile. Not all the time, but sometimes life throws things at you, and you just have to handle them. The trick is staying calm and knowing when to act. Jamie nodded, taking in the words. You didn't look scared, not even a little. Keanu chuckled softly and crouched down to meet Jamie's gaze. Everyone feels fear, Jamie. Even me. The difference is what you do with it. Shadow helps me with that. He glanced at the dog, who was now sitting by Jamie, his tail sweeping the ground in slow, steady movements. He reminds me to stay grounded no matter what. That night, Keanu lay awake, the soft hum of cicadas drifting through the open window. Shadow rested at the foot of the bed, his breathing slow and even. Keanu stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day. The gang's leader had looked so young, yet his eyes carried the weight of years lived recklessly. Keanu couldn't help but wonder what had driven someone like that to a life of intimidation and chaos. It wasn't anger he felt. It was a quiet sadness for someone who had likely been given few chances to choose a better path. The quiet of the night didn't last. A sharp crack broke the stillness, jolting Keanu upright. Shadow was already on his feet, ears alert and tail stiff. Keanu moved quickly to the window and peered out into the darkness. The faint glow of headlights flickered near the edge of the property, and the sound of muffled laughter carried through the trees. They're back, Keanu muttered under his breath. He pulled on a jacket and motioned for Shadow to follow, but this time, he left the dog inside as he stepped out into the cool night air. Shadow watched from the window, his eyes sharp and focused, as Keanu walked toward the source of the commotion. At the edge of the property, Keanu found the gang again, their bikes parked haphazardly on the gravel road. Two of them were spray painting a large rock near the entrance, while the others sat on their bikes, drinking and jeering loudly. The leader spotted Keanu first, his smirk returning as he straightened up. Couldn't sleep, Hollywood, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Keanu approached slowly, his hands in his pockets, his face calm but firm. You've had your fun, now leave. The leader stepped forward, shaking his head as if disappointed. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about fun. This is about teaching you a lesson. Keanu raised an eyebrow, unfazed. And what lesson is that? The leader leaned closer, his voice lowering. That people like you don't get to tell people like us what to do. The words hung in the air, heavy with bitterness. Keanu met the man's gaze, his expression unreadable. You've got a lot of anger in you, he said quietly, but this isn't the way to deal with it. For a moment the leader faltered, his jaw tightening as if Keanu's words had struck a nerve. But then he scoffed, shoving Keanu back a step. "Save the therapy session, we're not going anywhere." Keanu steadied himself, his posture unwavering. "You should. Before you do something, you'll regret." The leader opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, a sharp bark cut through the tension. Shadow had slipped out of the house and was now standing a few yards behind Keanu, his stance protective and his eyes locked on the gang. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, muttering among themselves. "Control your mutt," one of them said, his voice wavering slightly. Keanu didn't look back. "Shadow's better behaved than all of you combined, but if you're smart, you'll leave before he decides you're a threat." The leader hesitated, his confidence visibly wavering, as Shadow took a step closer, his growl low and menacing. Keanu stood firm, his calm demeanor unshaken. Finally, the leader raised a hand, signaling his crew to back off. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't over." They mounted their bikes and roared off into the night, their headlights disappearing into the darkness. Keanu let out a slow breath and turned to Shadow, kneeling to ruffle the dog's ears. "Good job, buddy. You're always one step ahead." Shadow licked his hand, his tail wagging lightly. Together they walked back toward the house, the night regaining its stillness. Keanu glanced back at the road one last time, his mind already bracing for what might come next. Shadow's quiet presence beside him was a reminder of the trust and resilience they shared, a bond that no gang of bikers could break. The morning broke with a cloudy sky, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Keanu stepped outside with Shadow, the dog padding silently beside him. Despite the quiet, Keanu felt the weight of the previous night pressing on him. The gang's actions weren't just petty antics anymore. They were calculated, fueled by something deeper. Keanu knew this wasn't over. Shadow seemed to sense his unease. He nudged Keanu's hand with his nose, a small but comforting gesture. "I know, buddy," Keanu murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "We'll handle it." The two began their morning routine, practicing more of Shadow's stunts for the upcoming movie. The sequence today was complicated. Shadow had to navigate a series of obstacles, retrieve a prop, and perform a perfectly timed leap onto a moving platform. Each movement required precision, focus, and trust. Keanu watched as Shadow executed the routine flawlessly, his movements smooth and calculated. "Brilliant," Joe, the stunt coordinator, called out as he approached. He clapped Keanu on the back, his grizzled face lighting up with approval. "I've worked with plenty of animals in this business, but Shadow? He's something else." Keanu smiled, his pride in Shadow evident. "He's got heart, that's what makes the difference." As they prepared for the next drill, Jamie appeared again, his bike skidding to a stop near the edge of the property. He hopped off and jogged over, his face flushed with excitement. "Keanu, Shadow, you've got to see this," he called out, waving a folded piece of paper in the air. Keanu frowned, meeting the boy halfway. "What's going on, Jamie?" Jamie unfolded the paper, revealing a flyer with bold, jagged writing scrawled across it. "You're not safe. Leave now." The edges of the paper were burned, and the smell of smoke clung to it. Jamie's voice dropped to a whisper. "I found it on the road near my house. They're serious, aren't they?" Keanu's jaw tightened as he scanned the flyer. Shadow stood by his side, his tail still, and his eyes sharp. Keanu folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his voice steady, "but we're not going anywhere." Jamie shifted nervously, glancing at Shadow. "But what if they—" Keanu cut him off gently. "Jamie, fear only works if you let it. Shadow and I, we don't let it." The boy nodded, drawing strength from Keanu's calm confidence. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go home for now, okay? Stay safe. I'll handle this." Jamie hesitated but eventually nodded, hopping back on his bike and pedaling off. Keanu watched him go, a faint crease forming between his brows. The bikers were escalating, testing boundaries and looking for weaknesses. Keanu knew he couldn't let them find any. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Keanu reinforced the property further, setting up additional lights around the perimeter and installing small cameras that Joe had loaned him. "If they come back," Joe said, handing over a monitor, "at least you'll see them before they see you." Shadow stayed close, his keen eyes scanning every movement in the trees. As night fell, a heavy rain began to pour, drenching the property and casting a veil of mist over the landscape. Keanu sat by the window with Shadow at his feet, watching the rain streak down the glass. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of thunder. It was close to midnight when Shadow suddenly lifted his head, his ears perking up. Keanu followed his gaze to the monitor on the table, where a faint movement caught his attention. In the grainy black-and-white feed, he saw the outline of a motorcycle slowly creeping along the road near the edge of the property. Another followed, and then another. "They're here," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady. Shadow stood, his posture tense but controlled. Keanu grabbed a flashlight and slipped on his jacket, motioning for Shadow to stay close. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and the sound of his boots squelching with every step was drowned out by the steady patter of water. As he approached the fence, the beams of two motorcycles cut through the rain. The gang had stopped just beyond the boundary, their figures barely visible in the downpour. The leader stepped forward, his leather jacket glistening with rain. He carried something in his hand, a chain, the metal links glinting in the light. "We warned you, Hollywood," the leader called out, his voice cutting through the storm. "You should have listened." Keanu's flashlight beam landed squarely on the man's face, but his expression didn't waver. "You've got one chance to leave," Keanu replied evenly. "Take it." The leader chuckled darkly. "You don't scare us." Keanu didn't move, his calm unwavering. Shadow let out a low growl, the sound barely audible over the rain, but enough to make the other bikers shuffle uneasily. The leader raised the chain, swinging it slowly. "You think that dog of yours is going to save you?" Keanu's grip on the flashlight tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Shadow doesn't need to save me. He's here to protect what matters. That includes this place and everyone in it." The leader took a step closer, but before he could say another word, Shadow sprang into action. With a sudden, calculated movement, the dog darted toward the fence, leaping over the muddy ground with the precision of a trained athlete. The gang flinched, their bravado cracking as the black lab stopped just short of the leader, baring his teeth in a fierce warning. The leader froze, his hand gripping the chain tightly. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Keanu stepped forward, his voice carrying through the rain like steel. "You've lost, and you know it. Now leave before you regret staying." The tension hung heavy in the air as the gang hesitated, their leader glancing between Shadow and Keanu. Finally, he spat on the ground and motioned to his crew. "Let's go." They revved their engines and disappeared into the storm, their taillights fading into the distance. Keanu crouched down, placing a hand on Shadow's wet fur. "Good job, boy," he said softly. Shadow's tail wagged faintly, his eyes still fixed on the road. As they walked back to the house, the rain continued to fall, but the air felt lighter. Keanu knew this wasn't the end, but for now, they had won the night. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world drenched and quiet, the air crisp with the scent of wet earth. Keanu walked the property with Shadow at his side, surveying the aftermath. The ground was a patchwork of puddles and mud, but the reinforced fence and lights had held strong. Shadow sniffed at the perimeter, his nose low to the ground, as if double-checking that the gang hadn't left behind any unwelcome surprises. Keanu's thoughts churned as he moved through his morning routine. The gang's retreat the night before had felt hollow, their leader's final glance back promising trouble to come. Keanu couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning of a larger storm. Later, as Keanu prepared to rehearse more stunts with Shadow, Jamie arrived again, his usual energy subdued. The boy parked his bike near the gate and walked over, his eyes darting nervously around the property. "They didn't come back, did they?" Jamie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not since last night," Keanu replied, kneeling to adjust Shadow's harness. "But we're staying ready." Jamie fidgeted, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "What if they do something worse, like really bad?" Keanu straightened, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Jamie, listen to me. People like them rely on fear. They want us to feel helpless. But we're not. We have each other and we have Shadow. That's more than enough." Jamie nodded, his expression softening. "Shadow's not scared of anything, is he?" Keanu smiled. "He's smart, not fearless. There's a difference. He knows when to act and when to hold back. That's what makes him special." Shadow let out a soft bark as if agreeing, and Jamie chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Can I help with the training today?" he asked eagerly. Keanu considered for a moment before nodding. "All right, but you have to listen carefully and do exactly what I say. Deal?" "Deal." Jamie's excitement returned full force, and he followed Keanu and Shadow to the training area. The session was focused on Shadow's ability to react to unexpected changes, a skill crucial for his role in the movie. Keanu set up an obstacle course with shifting platforms, sudden bursts of noise, and moving targets. Shadow navigated it with practiced ease, his movements precise and fluid. Jamie watched in awe, his earlier worries momentarily forgotten. "Your turn," Keanu said, tossing a small object to Jamie, a decoy prop meant to simulate an item Shadow had to retrieve. "Throw this into the course but make it challenging." Jamie hesitated, then grinned mischievously. He tossed the object into a far corner, embedding it between two wooden blocks. Shadow sprang into action, weaving through the obstacles and retrieving the prop effortlessly. The boy cheered, clapping his hands. "He's amazing!" Keanu laughed, his heart lifting at Jamie's enthusiasm. "Told you. He's the best." The day stretched on peacefully, the three of them working together to refine Shadow's skills. For a while, the gang felt like a distant memory, their threats overshadowed by the simple joy of shared purpose. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, Keanu couldn't ignore the gnawing unease at the edges of his thoughts. Trouble was coming. He could feel it. That night, as Keanu and Shadow settled in for the evening, the monitor from the perimeter cameras flickered to life. A faint, distorted image appeared, a figure moving quickly along the edge of the property. Keanu tensed, his gaze locked on the screen. Shadow, ever attuned to his partner, was on his feet in an instant, his body taut with readiness. The figure wasn't alone. Two others appeared in the grainy footage, their movements deliberate. Keanu recognized the leather jackets and the telltale swagger. The gang was back, and this time they were creeping closer. Keanu moved quickly, grabbing the flashlight and stepping into his boots. "Stay close," he said to Shadow, who followed without hesitation. Together they slipped out into the cool night air, the faint hum of insects the only sound. At the edge of the property, Keanu spotted them. The leader and two others were near the fence, their backs turned as they worked on something hidden in the shadows. Keanu shone the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice firm. The gang members froze, then turned slowly. The leader smirked, holding up what looked like a small bundle of wires and metal. "Relax, Hollywood," he said mockingly. "Just a little warning system. Didn't want you to get too comfortable." Keanu's heart pounded as he realized what the bundle was, a crude but functional explosive, rigged to detonate if triggered. His voice dropped into a steely calm. "Put it down, now." The leader chuckled, tossing the device lightly in his hand. "What's the matter? Dog too scared to come any closer?" Before Keanu could reply, Shadow stepped forward, his body low and his growl vibrating through the air. The leader's smirk faltered, but he covered it quickly. "See? That's the kind of loyalty you don't get from people. Shame it's wasted on you." Keanu took a step closer, his flashlight steady. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "Loyalty's earned, and I'm betting no one's loyal to you." The leader's face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed he might lunge forward. But before he could act, Shadow barked sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip. The other gang members flinched, and the leader reluctantly lowered the device. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low with menace. Keanu didn't reply, his gaze steady as he watched them retreat into the darkness. Once they were gone, he knelt beside Shadow, his hand resting on the dog's neck. "Good job, buddy," he murmured. Shadow pressed against him, his eyes still fixed on the road. Keanu knew the leader's words weren't empty. The gang was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were only getting higher. But as he looked at Shadow, steady and unwavering, Keanu felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning dawned with an uneasy quiet. The remnants of the gang's latest stunt hung heavy in the air. The near miss with the crude explosive seared into Keanu's mind. He had disarmed the device before dawn, his hands steady as he worked under Shadow's watchful eye. Now he was more determined than ever to put an end to the gang's intimidation. As he finished a light breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Keanu opened it to find Jamie standing on the porch, his bike propped haphazardly against the railing. The boy's face was pale, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a nervous energy. "They're in town," Jamie said quickly, his words tumbling out. "I saw them near the diner. They were talking about coming back here." Keanu placed a steadying hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Did they see you?" Jamie shook his head. "I don't think so. I was with my mom and I stayed in the car, but I heard them. They're planning something, Keanu. Something big." Keanu nodded, his jaw tightening. "You did the right thing, Jamie. Go home and stay there. I'll handle this." Jamie hesitated, his small fists clenched at his sides. "But what if they—" "Jamie," Keanu interrupted gently. "Trust me. Shadow and I have this." Reluctantly, the boy nodded and climbed onto his bike, pedaling away with one last worried glance. Keanu watched him go, his mind already calculating the next steps. He wasn't just dealing with a group of reckless bikers anymore. This was personal. They wanted to break him, to prove their dominance. But they had underestimated the strength of his resolve and the loyalty of the black lab at his side. Keanu spent the day reinforcing his preparations. The cameras were rechecked, the lights repositioned, and the training with Shadow became even more intense. This time he focused on scenarios that involved Shadow acting independently, retrieving objects or signaling danger without direct commands. Shadow's intelligence and precision were unmatched, and by the end of the session, Keanu felt a renewed sense of confidence. As the sun began to set, Joe arrived, pulling up in his old truck with a look of quiet determination. "Heard about what happened last night," Joe said, stepping out and adjusting his cap. "Figured you could use a hand." Keanu smiled faintly. "Appreciate it, Joe, but this isn't your fight." Joe shook his head. "I've been around long enough to know that no one fights alone if they don't have to. Besides, Shadow's got enough brains for all of us. I'm here to back him up." The two men worked together as the last light of day faded, setting up additional precautions and mapping out the property. Shadow moved between them, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the land. By the time darkness fell, everything was in place. Keanu stood by the window, watching the perimeter as Shadow lay at his feet, his body relaxed, but his ears alert. It wasn't long before the gang made their move. The hum of motorcycles echoed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Keanu's fingers tightened around the flashlight in his hand. Joe was stationed by the barn, a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, while Shadow stood ready at Keanu's side. The first figure appeared in the glow of the motion-activated lights, the leader stepping off his bike with a calculated swagger. The rest of the gang followed, their expressions a mix of confidence and menace. The leader called out, his voice cutting through the still night. "We're done playing games, Hollywood. Time to show you who's really in charge." Keanu stepped forward, his silhouette framed by the porch light. Shadow stayed at his side, his posture calm but poised for action. "You've already lost," Keanu said evenly. "You just don't know it yet." The leader laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Tough talk, but you're outnumbered, and your dog's not as scary as you think." Keanu didn't reply. Instead, he raised a hand, signaling Shadow. The black lab darted into the darkness, his movements silent and precise. Moments later, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the property, followed by a string of curses. Shadow had disarmed one of the gang's makeshift traps, scattering their tools into the mud. The gang's confidence wavered as the sounds of Shadow's movements rippled through the night. Each time they tried to regroup, Shadow appeared out of the shadows, barking sharply or knocking over equipment, keeping them off balance. Keanu used the chaos to his advantage, moving swiftly to cut off their escape routes. Joe joined the fray, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide Keanu and Shadow from one strategic position to the next. The gang's bravado began to crumble, their leader shouting orders that no one seemed eager to follow. Finally, Shadow cornered the leader near the barn, his growl low and steady. The man raised his hands, his usual smirk replaced by a look of genuine fear. "Call him off," he demanded, his voice cracking. Keanu stepped forward, his flashlight casting a harsh beam on the man's face. "Leave now," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't come back." The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between Keanu and Shadow. "You think this is over?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "It is for you." Shadow barked sharply, and the leader flinched. Without another word, he scrambled back to his bike, calling for his crew to follow. The gang retreated into the night, their engines fading into the distance. Keanu crouched down, placing a hand on Shadow's head. "Good work, buddy," he said softly. Shadow leaned into the touch, his tail wagging faintly. Joe approached, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "I've seen a lot in my time, but that dog of yours, he's one of a kind." Keanu smiled, glancing at Shadow. "He's more than that. He's family." As the two men stood in the quiet aftermath, the property felt different, stronger, more secure. The storm had passed, and for the first time in days, Keanu felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, he knew he and Shadow could handle it, together. The night settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Keanu and Shadow walked the property one last time, ensuring every corner was secure. The gang had fled, but the memory of their taunts and threats lingered like a shadow. Keanu knew the leader's parting words weren't idle. The man was bruised, his ego shattered, and that made him unpredictable. Shadow padded silently beside Keanu, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. Despite the stillness, Keanu felt the weight of tension in the air, an almost imperceptible shift that set his instincts on edge. They returned to the house, the soft glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. Keanu locked the door behind them and crouched beside Shadow, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You're my rock, you know that?" Keanu murmured, his voice low but steady. Shadow nudged his hand, his tail wagging faintly. The bond between them was unspoken, yet undeniable, a quiet strength that had carried them through every trial so far. The next day dawned bright and clear, the morning sun cutting through the remnants of tension that had gripped the estate. Keanu's determination remained unwavering as he resumed Shadow's training, this time incorporating Jamie into the drills. The boy arrived on his bike, his face flushed with determination and a newfound sense of purpose. "Are we going to make Shadow even better today?" Jamie asked, his enthusiasm bubbling over. Keanu smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Shadow's already the best, but we can always fine-tune things. You ready to help?" Jamie nodded eagerly, and the three of them got to work. They set up a series of new challenges for Shadow, retrieving objects from increasingly difficult spots, responding to signals in rapid succession, and navigating a complex obstacle course that Keanu and Jamie built together. Shadow performed each task with a mix of precision and flair, his natural intelligence shining through. "Do you think Shadow ever gets tired of being so awesome?" Jamie asked, his admiration for the dog evident in his wide eyes. Keanu laughed, shaking his head. "If he does, he never shows it, but it's not just about being awesome, it's about trust. Shadow knows I have his back, and I know he has mine." Jamie fell quiet for a moment, watching as Shadow executed another flawless maneuver. "I wish I could be that brave." Keanu knelt beside him, his tone gentle but firm. "Bravery isn't about never being scared, Jamie. It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. You've already got that in you." The boy looked up at Keanu, his expression softening with a mix of pride and resolve. "Thanks, Keanu. I'll try." As the day wore on, the peaceful atmosphere lulled them into a sense of normalcy. Keanu let himself hope just for a moment that the gang had truly been driven away for good. But as the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, a familiar unease crept back in. Shadow seemed to feel it too. His ears twitched, and his gaze lingered on the horizon. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, the monitor flickered to life again. Keanu's stomach sank as he saw the grainy image of the gang's motorcycles, this time parked farther from the property. The leader was there, pacing back and forth, his body language tense and agitated. He was holding something, a map it looked like, and pointing toward the estate. "They're not giving up," Keanu muttered, his voice grim. Shadow stood beside him, his body taut with anticipation. Keanu grabbed the walkie-talkie and called Joe, who was still on standby at the barn. "They're back. Looks like they're planning something bigger this time." "On my way," Joe's voice crackled through the device. "Stay sharp." Keanu took a deep breath, his mind racing through their options. The gang's persistence was unnerving, but it also meant they were desperate, grasping at straws to regain control. Keanu wasn't about to let them take anything from him. Not his peace, not his home, and certainly not Shadow. When Joe arrived, the two men quickly devised a plan. They repositioned the lights to create strategic blind spots and used decoy sounds to mislead the gang into thinking they had the upper hand. Shadow's role was critical. He would monitor the gang's movements and alert Keanu to any immediate threats. As the gang crept closer, their leader's voice carried faintly through the night. "Tonight we finish this. No more games." Keanu exchanged a glance with Joe. "They're underestimating us," he said quietly. "That's their first mistake." The gang split into smaller groups, moving cautiously through the property. Shadow moved like a shadow himself, weaving between the trees and staying just out of sight. Each time one of the gang members veered too close to their hiding spot, Shadow signaled Keanu with a soft bark, allowing them to stay one step ahead. The leader, growing impatient, barked orders at his crew. "Spread out, he's here somewhere." Keanu and Joe used the chaos to their advantage, cutting off the gang's escape routes and forcing them toward the perimeter. The plan worked flawlessly until one of the bikers stumbled upon a hidden tripwire Joe had set earlier. A loud crack echoed through the trees as the trap triggered, startling the gang and sending them into disarray. Shadow seized the moment, appearing out of the darkness to confront the leader directly. The man froze, his bravado finally cracking as the black lab bared his teeth, his growl low and menacing. Keanu emerged moments later, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the gang's panic. "It's over," Keanu said, his voice steady. "Leave now, and don't come back." The leader looked around, realizing his crew was scattered and demoralized. Defeated, he threw his hands up in frustration. "Fine," he spat. "You win this round." Keanu didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the man until he turned and walked away. One by one the gang retreated, their motorcycles rumbling into the distance. As the night fell quiet again, Keanu crouched beside Shadow, scratching behind his ears. "You're incredible. You know that?" he said softly. Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes bright with loyalty and pride. Joe joined them, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You handled that like a pro," he said. "I'd fight alongside you two any day." Keanu smiled, looking out over the now empty property. "I think we've seen the last of them." But even as he said the words, a flicker of uncertainty lingered in the back of his mind. He had won the battle, but he knew the war might not yet be over. Still, with Shadow at his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The gang's retreat left an eerie calm in its wake. The property was quiet, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath. Keanu spent the next day repairing minor damages and double-checking the security measures with Joe. Shadow stayed close, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Jamie arrived later that afternoon, his face alight with curiosity. "Are they gone for good?" he asked, skidding his bike to a halt. Keanu crouched down to tighten a latch on the fence. "For now," he replied, glancing at Shadow who sat nearby. "But we're not taking any chances." Jamie nodded solemnly, as if absorbing the weight of the situation. Then his gaze shifted to Shadow, and his expression brightened. "Can we do more training today? I want to see if I can help Shadow with something cool." Keanu smiled faintly. "Shadow already knows all the cool tricks, but sure, we can try." The three of them worked together through the afternoon, refining Shadow's agility and precision. Jamie became more confident in his role, throwing decoy props and setting up small challenges for the Black Lab. Shadow, as always, responded flawlessly, earning cheers and laughter from the boy. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Keanu felt a rare sense of peace. The bond between them, Keanu, Shadow, and even Jamie, felt unshakable, a force stronger than the fear the gang had tried to impose. But that night, the peace shattered once again. Keanu had just settled into bed when the monitor screen flickered, showing a faint, distorted image. This time it wasn't just the gang's motorcycles. The leader and his crew had returned with more people, new recruits armed with tools and equipment that gleamed in the moonlight. It was clear this wasn't just an act of revenge anymore. It was an all-out assault. "They're escalating," Keanu muttered, pulling on his boots and jacket. Shadow was already at the door, his body tense and alert. Keanu called Joe on the walkie-talkie, his voice calm but firm. "They've brought reinforcements. I need you here now." Joe's reply was immediate. "On my way. Hold them off as best you can." Keanu armed himself with the tools he had prepared: flares, flashlights, and other non-lethal deterrents designed to disorient and scatter the intruders. Shadow stayed close, his growl low and steady, as they moved out into the night. The gang split into two groups, one heading toward the barn and the other toward the main house. Keanu knew they were trying to corner him, but he had anticipated this. Using the cameras to track their movements, he guided Shadow to intercept the first group near the barn. The Black Lab moved with precision, darting between shadows and herding the intruders toward a narrow path where Joe was waiting. A loud burst of light erupted from the flare Joe had ignited, startling the gang and sending them scrambling. "Stay down, or the dog gets you," Joe bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Shadow barked sharply, his presence enough to deter the remaining stragglers. Meanwhile, Keanu faced the second group near the house. Using the decoy lights and traps he had set earlier, he led them in circles, their frustration mounting as they realized they were being outmaneuvered. When the leader finally stumbled into the clearing, Keanu stood waiting, Shadow at his side. "It's over," Keanu said, his voice calm but unwavering. "Walk away while you still can." The leader sneered, his arrogance faltering as Shadow took a step forward, baring his teeth. "You think you've won? This isn't just about you anymore," he spat. "We've got nothing to lose." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "That's where you're wrong. You have everything to lose if you stay." The tension broke as the leader faltered, glancing around to see his crew retreating. Shadow growled, a low, rumbling warning, and the man finally raised his hands. "Fine," he muttered, backing away. "But this isn't the end." Keanu watched as the gang disappeared into the night, their defeat absolute. Shadow relaxed slightly, his posture still vigilant. Keanu knelt beside him, scratching his ears. "You're a force of nature, you know that?" he said softly. Shadow wagged his tail, his loyalty shining in his eyes. Joe joined them moments later, his face a mix of relief and admiration. "You've got a guardian angel in that dog," he said. "I don't think they'll be coming back after this." Keanu nodded, his resolve firm. "Let's hope you're right." The following morning, the estate was bathed in golden light, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. The air was crisp and quiet, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked grass. Keanu stood on the porch with Shadow, his gaze sweeping over the property. Every corner felt hard-earned, a testament to their resilience. Jamie arrived as usual, his bike skidding to a stop with a dramatic flair. "Did they come back?" he asked, wide-eyed. Keanu smiled faintly. "They did. But we sent them packing." Jamie grinned, glancing at Shadow. "I bet it was Shadow who really scared them." Keanu chuckled, patting the Black Lab's head. "You're not wrong." The three spent the day repairing the last remnants of damage and sharing quiet moments of camaraderie. For the first time in days, the tension seemed to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of security. Later that evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows across the field, Keanu sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet. Jamie had gone home, and Joe had returned to his truck, satisfied that the gang was gone for good. The peaceful stillness of the night felt like a hard-won victory. Keanu glanced down at Shadow, who rested his head on his paws, his eyes half closed. "You're more than a dog, Shadow," Keanu said quietly. "You're family, and I don't know what I'd do without you." Shadow's tail thumped softly against the wood, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The two sat together as the stars began to emerge, their presence a testament to the strength that comes from trust, loyalty, and an unbreakable connection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Keanu knew they would face them together, side by side, ready for anything.